As you've just heard, I'm a retired ENT surgeon, and that's my office, my operating theatre. I specialised in otology, which is conditions of the ear and hearing. I've also had a long relationship with the British Tinnitus Association, almost 20 years in fact, and I'm currently the president of that organisation. I'm also an educator and a researcher, and I'm also the author of a tinnitus self-help book. And that's a picture of my book, and these are my co-authors. That's Lawrence McKenna, and the guy there in the middle is David Bagley, who sadly died in June this year. And you might say, well, what on earth am I doing at someone else's book signing? It does seem a bit sort of self-defeating on my part to support someone else's self-help book. I'll try and explain a bit, and I think the simplest way to do that is to give you my sort of view of tinnitus, how I try and explain tinnitus to people. And there are various definitions. Hashir, in his book, has very carefully avoided making any real definition. He says that if you've got tinnitus, you already know what it is, and you don't need an explanation. It's certainly very common. Right now in the UK, we estimate that about 1 in 8 people have it, and as Helen said, the lifetime risk is probably somewhere around 1/3. There's no gender divide. It happens to all age groups, including children. The number of people with it increases up to the 7th decade of life, and then, curiously, it seems to plateau or even become less common after that. There's no recommended drug treatment, there is no cure. And there's often little real support from the conventional medical pathways in the country, and the fact that this room is full probably kind of proves that. If we opened a sort of an encyclopedia of the ear, or asked our GP to describe how hearing works, we'd probably hear something like this, that there's an eardrum, there's some little bones that conduct the sound through, and then there's an inner ear, a cochlea, which turns the sound, the mechanical sound vibrations into electricity. And that's how a lot of people kind of think of hearing. And if you think like that, your model of tinnitus is that it's one of damage to that organ, damage to the little microscopic hair cells in the inner ear. And if you think like that, well, that's why GPs come out with a statement that, yeah, you've got tinnitus, there's nothing that can be done about it. But there are some paradoxes with tinnitus. You can have tinnitus and have a perfectly normal audiogram, a perfectly normal hearing test. Brian and Hashir go into that in their book, and they say, well, if you look hard enough, you might find that there's little bits of damage. However, you can certainly have a substantially normal hearing and still have tinnitus. It is more common if you've got hearing loss, but the degree of hearing loss doesn't correlate at all with the degree of tinnitus. And it's possible to have really awful hearing and not have any tinnitus. It's even possible to cut through the auditory nerve and still have tinnitus. So what's going on? Why? We need to think a bit more in depth about the auditory system. We need to think that actually the auditory system is not just the ear and the auditory nerve, but it's lots of things that go on in the brain too. And I've simplified it here. These are actually pictures from our self-help book. There's a box that we call filtering and pattern recognition. And this is the it's like the information goes from the ear into the brain, and then the brain decides what it wants to listen to and what it can safely ignore. So it's the switch that if you're in a party and someone mentions your name across the other side of the room, you go, ooh, who's talking about me? And you tune into that conversation. On the flip side, you can tune out of things too, and it's the filter that allows men to completely ignore whatever their wives are saying. If it decides that stuff can go through that, it lets it through to the cortex, that's the thinking bit of the brain, the conscious awareness bit, but it also has a link to our emotional brain and to our adrenaline center, our fight or flight center. And here's a little slide of everything working as it should work. So there's music coming in here, the ear is doing its business, it's turning it into a digital stream of electrical information. The filters say, yeah, I'll listen to that. So I'm aware that there's music playing and it's giving me pleasure or excitement or whatever other emotion is in that bit of music, and I'm getting the appropriate response from my autonomic nervous system. These nerves in the auditory system, though, they're not like wires in a bit of electrical equipment. Even when there's no input, these wires are, the nerves are electrically active. There's always some background activity. And normally, the filters block that and nothing happens. But sometimes that process doesn't work. And the two common things are if your hearing is going down, the filter's open to let more auditory information through, but they also let this electrical junk through. The other thing that can happen is that if you're under stress, this can make the filters open and let information through. And if that happens, we then set everything up to trigger off a series of vicious circles. And once that's up and running, this bit over here, the ear, becomes unimportant. This is the main bit. So if we look at it in this way, there's the tinnitus sound, which, as Hashir and Brian point out multiple times in the book, that CBT and other treatments do not help. But there's the reaction to that process, and that's where the treatments like CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, have their effect. Of course, we're humans, so we make things more complicated, and we go off and we think about things, and we have different personalities. We've looked a bit at that in our research, and tinnitus people definitely seem to have overrepresented with the perfectionist gene. And we also have a lot of life circumstances happening that play into this too. Our book, it's a very detailed explanation of tinnitus, and it explains all the different subtypes, and it explains all the information about food and drink and drugs, and it was designed as a multidisciplinary approach. So the three of us all had very different approaches to tinnitus, and we all brought our own little bits into it. And there isn't a single thread to the book. It's multiple threads. It does explain a bit about CBT, but it doesn't take you through the process fully. In contrast, Hashir and Brian's book, they do explain tinnitus, but it's a pretty brief bit. It's one relatively small chapter in the book. But then the rest of the book starts off in a step-by-step explanation about using cognitive behavioral therapy to manage tinnitus, to treat tinnitus. It's got multiple, you've flicked through it, I'm sure, multiple practical worksheets for you to fill in yourselves, or if you don't want to mess up your book, for you to photocopy and fill in. I don't know, are you going to... online. Or get them online. It gives very comprehensive advice about when to use tinnitus, when to use CBT, and also when not to use CBT. And there's also a very useful bit at the end about, if you've been successful with this approach, how to maintain that success and what happens with the inevitable little setbacks that we all experience. Having read the book cover to cover, I would agree with what the authors themselves say, which is, it is not a quick fix, it is not a cure, and it is not easy. You will need to put in a lot of hard work yourselves to make it happen. And it's going to take you at least 2 months to work through that process. Once you've done so, actually, a lot of, although it's tinnitus directed, a lot of it you can direct at other bits to your life. You will also need to become an expert in abbreviations, because the book is full of them. So I think the two books are really complementary, and I think that the book that I wrote with Dave and Larry, really, it's kind of a theory of tinnitus book, whereas Hashir and Brian's book is more the practical. I think they work well together, and I would certainly recommend people to read Hashir and Brian's book. And I'm going to shut up and let them speak for themselves now. Thank you.